Hello everyone, this is Poppin' Threadbare and welcome back to Weaving Worlds. For today's video, I'm going to be focusing on conflict, which is the core of any story. And while many stories can be told about personal conflicts, you can also create stories about larger conflicts, about wars, revolutions, rebellions, and other large-scale fights. Sometimes the story is about the war itself, sometimes it's about a personal journey during the war, and sometimes the war is in the past, but its lingering effects still influence the way people think in the present. That's why it can be useful when creating a setting to think of the reasons why wars are fought. What follows is a list of some of the reasons why people go to war, but I should first point out that very few wars were ever fought for only one reason. People will certainly argue with each other about the true reason a given war was fought, but the fact is that wars are dangerous, wasteful, and very often unpopular with the people who do all the fighting. You need more than one reason to take the kind of risk that a war entails. And so while a war may have one primary reason, that reason will always have company. So don't think of any of the following reasons for war as exclusionary. Number 1. Resource acquisition. If there is only ever one reason to wage war, then it's because some people have resources and other people would prefer to have them instead. Colonialism, imperialism, invasions, raids, all of that comes down at least to some extent to resource acquisition and exploitation. An empire, or at least one definition of an empire, is a single culture or society that can force other groups to extract and create resources, and then send them the fruits of their labor. Several empires in history have been very permissive about how their subjects live their lives and how they're allowed to govern themselves, but that's only because their focus is on extracting resources. If the flow of money and luxury goods ends, that's when bad things start to happen. Raids are similar to imperialism in terms of resource acquisition, but they're smaller in scale. The aggressors come in, take what they can carry, maybe burn what they can't, and then leave. But then raids can lead to imperialism or an invasion, as the defenders weaken and the raiders notice that there's nothing stopping them from sticking around. Modern warfare involves a lot less invading and direct imperialism, but access to resources is still a major priority when it comes to declaring and waging wars. Number 2. Expansionism. All life forms have a built-in directive to grow, but there are a lot of different ways to express this directive. Trees get bigger, grasses cover fields, rabbits multiply, and human societies convince their neighbors to adopt their culture. Sometimes this happens through cultural osmosis and missionary work, but other times it happens through conquest, repression, and cultural genocide. I said before that many empires were and are permissive regarding their subjects' lives, but then a lot of other empires weren't, and aren't. In the Arabian Empire, non-Muslims could be taken as slaves and were forced to pay an extra tax. In the Spanish Empire, Native Americans were forced to convert to Christianity, and just to make sure it stuck, they killed their priests and destroyed their cultural artifacts. Actions like these cannot be explained solely by a desire for resources. They happen because people want to spread their culture. Expansionism still exists in the modern era, but these days, nations are less likely to take direct control and more likely to fund proxy wars. And that's where expansionist nations will each fund and support different local factions and have them fight it out. Then whichever side wins will support the nation that helped them and thus increase that nation's influence. Number 3. Regime change. Sometimes the person in charge is not the one you want to be in charge, and often the only way to remove that person is to start a war. This is actually one of the primary functions of a democracy. It allows a country to change its regime without having to kill anyone. Other ways to change a regime include assassination and coups d'etats, but sometimes there's nothing else for it but to start a war. Now, there are several kinds of war that fit into this category, depending on who starts it and what their exact goal is. There's also a lot of overlap between each type, and so you shouldn't take the following list as the one and only set of definitions. Think of it more as a set of examples. A revolution is a populist war against a monarch or dictator that seeks to change the form of government. A civil war is an attempt to replace the current ruler with someone else without changing the nature of the government. A war of independence is an attempt to split off from an existing country so that the locals can rule themselves. A war of conquest is an attempt to merge two or more countries under a single government. Finally, there are wars to install friendly regimes in other countries that are outside your direct control, such as puppet states, vassals, tributaries, allies, or whatever else you want to call them. I'm not sure this kind of war has its own name, but it's been around from the start and still exists today. Number 4. Defensive assistance. When different countries or city-states want to protect themselves against larger, more aggressive neighbors, they'll form defensive pacts. That way, if one country gets invaded, every other country in the pact will declare war, and now the invader has to fight a dozen enemies instead of just one. It's a good way to protect countries that are otherwise at risk of being gobbled up by imperial or colonial powers. And while ideally a defensive pact should never be tested, sometimes it is, and thus countries go to war to defend other countries. Historically, however, defensive pacts tend to be unreliable. The fortunes of a country can change over time, and a nation previously in good standing might become too weak to offer any assistance, or they might become so strong that they don't need their old defensive partners. There could also be a pact member who gets attacked far more often than the others, and they might be cut loose for being too much of a liability. Or the members of a pact could fall to infighting, thus breaking the alliance and allowing that imperial neighbor to gobble them up one by one. Number 5. Moral outrage. Moral outrage is generally used more as a reason to justify war than as a reason to go to war. After all, it's quite easy to furrow your brow, click your tongue, and then ignore the horrors going on in other countries. Actually doing something about it is a lot harder, and much more dangerous. Plus, as we've seen with numerous recent examples, the locals tend to not appreciate such interference even when the horrors are real. And then cultural relativity is often a factor when it comes to moral outrage. A common practice in one culture could be viewed as reprehensible and alien in another, even if that practice is simply a belief in a different set of gods, or a different way of worshipping the same god. Other times you'll see the leaders of a country invent crimes to justify their wars. Julius Caesar gained a whole bunch of bad habits during his war against the Senate, at least according to his enemies, and the Templars became godless pagans shortly after the French king decided to purge their order and seize their cash reserves. So while moral outrage never causes a war, it is a good way to make a war popular. Number 6. Retaliation. The word revanchism is based on the French word for revenge, and it entered the English lexicon thanks to the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. When Prussia won the war, they annexed the region of Alsace-Lorraine from France, and in the years to come, the French people became obsessed with the loss. It spurred on nationalist thinking, and according to the French, that particular piece of land was destined to be a part of France, and the Prussians committed an unforgivable crime when they stole it. This desire for vengeance didn't lead directly to war, but it did inform France's decision to ally with the new German Empire's enemies, and after World War I, it became a reason for France to punish Germany with harsh conditions in the Treaty of Versailles. And then because of that treaty, revanchism became popular in Germany. Much like moral outrage, retaliation, revenge, and revanchism aren't reasons to go to war so much as they're reasons to justify war. However, revenge and grudges do play a more active role in diplomacy than moral outrage. And so while they don't cause a war directly, they can influence international policies, and that can lead to war. So while retaliation may be more petty and emotional than resource acquisition or colonialism, you really should keep it in mind for when you're plotting out a war. Number 7. Preemptive aggression. Like I said before, countries rise and fall because of changes in leadership, the movement of trading routes, new discoveries in technology, climate change, foreign intervention, and all kinds of other factors. Because of this, a nation that could defeat its neighbor one day might find it impossible to defeat them 10 years later. So if a country notices that its neighbor is building up its forces on the border and spending all of its money on weapons and food stocks, it might be best to preempt the invasion and attack first, before the neighbor is ready to fight. This doesn't happen often today, since starting a war is generally frowned upon, and it didn't happen often in previous eras because you need really good information to make that kind of call, but it does happen from time to time. The way wars are fought has changed a lot over the years, but the nature of war is very much the same, as are the reasons countries fight them. Wars are also a constant fact of life, even today, and so no matter when your setting takes place, it's always a good idea to think of the wars that have happened, are happening, and may happen in the future. Thanks for joining me again for today's journey into Weaving Worlds. Please like, share, and subscribe because that raises my visibility here on YouTube. Check out my other stuff if you have some time, support me on Patreon if you have some money, and I hope I'll see you again for the next video.